Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Inclusion First Project and our weekly ally Q&A on anti-racism. My name is Carrie Sawyer, and I am your host today. I would love to welcome on my co-host, Andrea Villa. She's going to get her video going, and we are going to jump right in. So while she is coming on, I just want to explain to you what the Inclusion First Project is. The Inclusion First Project is really all about understanding inclusion through the lens of the questions and conversations that come up when allies are talking about anti-racism. And sorry, we're having one technical thing. 1 second, let me get this, make it so that my co-host can turn on her video. Okay, Andrea, you should be able to turn on your video now. Yay! Hey. Awesome, thank you. Sorry about that. We are here today to answer questions that people have on anti-racism, whether that be about things happening at home, at work, and anywhere in between. So Andrea, will you introduce yourself to the group today?
Hi, everyone. My name is Andrea Villa, and I'm super excited to be part of this. I'm a design researcher, user experience researcher. I self-identify as a queer Latina with white skin privilege, and I'm also an activist, a community activist in queer and mostly Chicano Latinx spaces.
Awesome. Well, Andrea, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited. Andrea and I worked together in a past life, and we were allies together for many good work causes. And so I'm excited to have this kind of conversation in this forum, in this way with you, because I definitely value your opinion. And I know that people will get a lot from your insights as well. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and we're just going to go over the flow really quick tonight, and then we will dive right in. So, oh, you know what, Andre, can you pass me back the host privileges? That way I can share my screen. It's Zoom. I know everyone probably got that little update, your Zoom, and so some of the functions have changed and some of them are the same and they just work weird. So thank you. Okay. So tonight's flow, the first thing we're going to do is just set the tone, and we want to really create a positive judgment-free space. And so we're going to talk through exactly what that means. Then we are going to offer some definitions. You know, we're here to talk about anti-racism and allyship. Well, what do those words mean? Now let's get everyone on the same page. And then we will go right into the questions that you have submitted. Now there's another way to get your questions answered, which is to put them either in the Q&A or in the chat. If you'd like to stay anonymous, you can put your question in the Q&A. You do have to go by, there's a little drop down caret by your name, and you can switch that to anonymous. And that way we won't know who it is. Either way, we're not going to call out who's asking questions. If you're in the chat, obviously everyone can see that. But we would love to get your questions as we go. So if you have something that's sparked as part of the conversation that Andrea and I are having, feel free to throw that in either of those areas. And we will answer as many questions as we can during this hour that we are together. Okay, so the first thing that we like to do is create a positive space. And I'd like to emphasize that this is a safe space and all questions are welcome that come from a place of wanting to learn more, do better in, the journey towards anti-racism and really, working through all of the different isms that we have. As long as your question is coming from a place of wanting to learn, I don't care if you think the question is stupid or you should know it, or even it's a little bit racist, we will take your question, we will talk through it, we will break it apart, and we will leave you with some ways to think about your question differently. The next thing is that there is no shame or blame. This is a judgment-free zone. So we really do mean that. No judgment at all. Andrea and I are speaking for ourselves only. And this is kind of the first tip and trick that you can take with you when you're having conversations about race in your own life, speaking just for yourself. I'm not speaking for all women. I'm not speaking for all Black women or all Black people. Andrea is not speaking for all Latinx people, all queer people. She's speaking for herself. I'm speaking for myself, and we're taking each other just as the people that we have in front of us. We're dropping all stereotypes, all assumption, and just listening to understand and connect on a human level. To that end, we also don't know everything. We're all learning in this space, and that's why we're here. That's why we're having these conversations, is to learn and to fill in the gaps of our own knowledge. I don't know everything about being Black or all the history of Black people or everything that's ever happened, and no one does, right? So as we're working together, as we're talking, we're going to learn new things. We're going to make missteps, and all of that is okay, because this is a lifelong journey. This isn't something where we're like just raising our hand right now to be anti-racist because of the recent news or most recent killings versus, the long history of. But we're here on a lifelong journey together. And so we are going to continue to move. And everyone is at a different point, and that is totally okay. So your role in driving this type of change will be unique, because we're all uniquely situated, in our family units, in our communities, at work. And so we'll all get a chance to have an opportunity to play a role, but it's always going to be unique. And that process, our process of understanding what it means to be anti-racist, our process in enacting that in the world, is always going to be different than the person next to us. So we're really not looking to compare, but more looking to understand our role, our privilege, and how we can use that for good. I saw hang on one second. Okay, so we're going to jump into some definitions, and I'm just making sure that, sorry, I saw the chat flashing. So I was going to check in there to make sure. And again, if you have questions, feel free to pop that into the chat, and we will take those on as well. Sorry, one more technical thing. I am trying to get Andrea's video back on. Okay, I think it should work, Andrea. Okay, good. Thank you. So I wanted to start off by talking about anti-racism, and we're also going to we're going to talk a little bit about racism based on some of the questions. But Andrea, I would love to get your thoughts as we think about definitions that actually work for people as well. And so this definition of anti-racism is from Race Forward. Anti-racism is really the work of actively opposing racism by advocating changes in political, economic, and social life. And what I'd like about this, like, kind of simple, like, to the point definition, is that it really is kind of comprehensive. So like politics, government, economic, how money moves, access, and then social life, which is basically everything else. We're looking at where racism shows up, and then how we can get in the way of it, how we can interrupt it, and how we can rework, redesign, make the systems different such that they no longer create these like racist outcomes. Andrea, how do you break down anti-racism for like the regular person?
I so love this definition, because it is the words actively opposing, right? It equates any action equals opposition. It's going to be tiny, like teeny tiny. It doesn't mean that I have to chain myself, to the fence at the White House. I don't have to put on a seminar. Maybe it's as simple as me talking to my best friend when my best friend does something that's a little insensitive. Even attending this, right? Or reading a book and then implementing something small. So anti-racism for me is an experience. It is an ongoing state of mind.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's because mind happens before action. And then whatever action I take is the action I take.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love that. So, and this really goes right into what Andrea was saying. So anti-racism is used to describe what it means to actively fight against racism rather than passively claim to be a non-racist or not a racist. And if you have been following any of Dr. Kendi's work in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and any of the conversations around that, there's this definite idea of like, it's not enough to not be a racist, because in that you are sitting passively. You are not interrupting racism and therefore letting racism to continue around you. And so we really want to claim this idea of anti-racism, actively fighting, actively interrupting, shading. And I love what Andrea said. It's in that can be an understanding more about you and your own privilege. It can be about reading. It can be about shading yourself to that fence if that's where you are most called to serve. Um, but
Yeah.
it isn't sitting on the sideline saying, I'm not a racist, because that isn't helping to get in the way of the racist systems that are happening all around us all the time.
Right. I want to, so this calls to mind something else, and the folks here today or watching later may have read this. Ijeoma Oluo.
Alua. Mm-hmm.
Oluo. So her book, so you want to talk about race. So she says that systemic racism is a machine that runs whether you pull the lever or not.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's running. You don't have to pull a lever in order to benefit. And not pulling the lever doesn't mean that you're stepping back from it. It continues to put out its widgets of privilege and benefits. And so not interrupting that machine means one is complicit
Mm-hmm.
in the benefits that it conveys.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I have a quote from her a little bit later. Maybe even, yes, just after this slide. So
Okay.
I wanted to know, I love that. Thank you. It's a good segue. So I wanted to like just dig into this just a teeny bit more. So this idea of anti-racist ideas. And so this is any idea that suggests that all racial groups are equal in all of their differences, and there's nothing wrong with any racial group. And this is directly from Dr. Kendi's book. And so I wanted to pull this out because this is really like the foundation of how like racism, like it's in the foundation of racism, right? That like people of color, that Black people specifically in this country during slavery, were less than a full person, right? We were like 3/5 of a person. And so this idea of being like explicitly, authentically, completely anti-racist is to just say, we no longer like subscribe to any of this idea that one race is better or worse than another. All races are equal and there's nothing wrong. No one needs any improvement. These different stereotypes and assumptions that we have about each other aren't actually based in anything biological or genetic. We are all the same. So I wanted to just fold that in. So when you hear the term anti-racist ideas, it really is just this, just as simple as this. And it might be something that's kind of foreign to people because I don't think like that anymore, but this is like the foundation. And people, we don't think like that anymore. I've never thought like that. Sorry, I misspoke. But people who actively are supporting racist ideas, that might be one of the justifications, right? Well, they're not as good. They're deficient. They're lesser, right? And so this is the opposite of that. Andrea, any thoughts or anything around anti-racist ideas? I know I went like I went high level, and this. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So the one, yes, any idea that suggests that all racial groups are equals. And there's two things for me in this. One is that there is such a thing as a racial group because that's a social construct. It is completely, it's not a thing. Like, it's just not a thing. People made it up. Like, it is a social construct. So there's that. And there's also that I don't need to be explicitly, consciously be aware of a belief that one racial group is superior to another for me to actually believe that. Right? So we are raised, like we are steeped, we are little tea bags steeping in racism from the moment we're born, because that is the machine that we're living in here and in Western culture and in many cultures, right? It's so I don't need to identify myself as consciously agreeing with that in order to somewhere have a belief that so let's just say white society, white people are superior to other people of different races or ethnicities. Mm-hmm. Even as a person of color, like that's buried in there somewhere. And so this anti-racist work is actively interrogating that and interrupting that in myself. Mm-hmm. So, maybe we can add that to the things that people can do to take anti-racist action.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And that really speaks beautifully to
Ah,
Idoma's quote.
yeah.
Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And it's the only way forward. And yes, we know that there are all of these systems outside of us that are racist, but there is racism in all of us because exactly what Andrea said, we grew up in this country, we grew up in the Western world, and racism is everywhere, right? It's in every single system that we can think about, and it's measurable, right? So how can we find it there? But then how can we find the seeds of it inside of ourselves so that we can not only be able to recognize it, but also get rid of it, right? Mitigate it, transform it into something inclusive, something connective to our fellow humans. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit. We want to talk a little bit about allyship. And Andrea, I would love to get your perspective on allyship. I'm going to go through this definition, but just because of the other ways that allyship can be used in the other contexts, I'd love to hear how you expand on something like this and what that looks like for you. But allyship, an active, consistent, and challenging practice of unlearning and reevaluating in which a person of privilege seeks to work in solidarity with a marginalized group. So there is a lot in this. Active, consistent. I love that it says challenging practice because, again, we're trying to unlearn, we're trying to interrupt the systems both inside ourselves and outside of ourselves. And that work isn't easy and it doesn't happen by accident. And then using your privilege for good to help people who are less privileged or without privilege in the different systems around you. And again, whether that be in your neighborhood, in your community, your place of faith, in your work, everywhere, right? So we have these great opportunities.
Oh gosh. So I have been on a journey, over my life about what does allyship mean. And I saw an earlier session that you did with Bernie Cox, who just did a great job breaking this down, that um, it is a journey. There is no destination here.
Mm,
Allyship, it's a verb, it's not a noun. There really isn't any such thing as an ally. There's only people who are actively, consistently challenging themselves and the systems around them. That's what that is. And inherent in that, like what this doesn't say, with this this definition, it kind of hints at it with challenging. It's a great way to practice feeling deeply uncomfortable. It is a
mm,
great way to practice making friends with one's own humanity. I'm a deeply flawed human being. And even though I think I know stuff, I don't know a lot. And I apparently don't know enough to keep myself from parroting and embodying sometimes, to my great personal disappointment and shame, embodying some of the racist principles that I have learned,
mm,
just in weird ways. Like, and this is even this, and that's part of the journey, is to
mhm.
continue. It's that unlearning and reevaluating. So when I say unlearning, this is iterative. This is a deeply iterative process.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And Andrea, we got a question in the Q&A, which I always love, based on some comments that we had earlier, and it kind of speaks to what you were talking about. How do we find the seeds of racism in ourselves? How do we stumble upon those? How do we actively identify them? And when I'm thinking about this question, I think that it has a lot to do with, like, there's probably more than two, but two ways that come to mind for me. The first way is to like educate yourself. Like, how are you reading and engaging in the discussions that are happening out there and getting more information, and not just like information in alignment with what you already know, but reading those books that make you feel uncomfortable, reading those books and hearing these things, and then understanding, like, how does this go into my mind? How does this match with what I believe or don't believe? Where might I be wrong and where can I be expanded? Right. So there's this kind of external information where we can stumble upon our own seeds of racism, but then how do we actually, like when we have these interactions with people, how can we identify that we actually are, you know, to your point earlier, Andrea, that we actually are carrying these seeds and that we're acting and speaking in ways that are harming other people, that are pushing forward stereotypes and assumptions. And I think one of those is when, you know, when we're challenged or when we're called out on these things, is instead of being defensive and like, I didn't do that, I didn't mean that, actually like kind of taking that in. Right now it's not in our habit to call people out for these types of transgressions, but I think that that's something that needs to change in order for us to learn. Actually, like when we hear people saying racist things or doing racist things, like taking them aside or coming into a conversation with them, where we can let them know what the impact of their words were, to us,
Mm,
and finding a way to do that in a way that maybe doesn't put them on the defensive, but opens up a channel of communication. If we
mm,
started to do that with each other, like made that a habit, I would learn as a Black woman when I was being racist against other Black people, against Latinos, against Asian people, against everyone, right? So being afraid to call people out, I think is something that we have to actually obliterate, because we're not going to learn. And we need to learn how to do it with grace and with understanding, and with empathy, but still, how do we change that dialogue? So instead of being like, can you believe what that person just said, inside my own head, like actually finding a good way to articulate that and to interrupt that moment, because even if that person is defensive and doesn't like acknowledge, it's still going to stick with them that happened, and maybe the next time that someone calls them out, it will have more of an impact in changing behavior or bringing more awareness to them. So what do you think, Andrea? How do we how do we find these seeds in ourselves?
So I think one of the, as human beings, we're pattern matchers. We recognize things that look like other things. And so in order to see something, it's important for me at least to have an example. Like, oh, do I recognize that thing in myself? And so it's been helpful for me in my reading to see, to read about examples of microaggressions,
Mm-hmm.
scenarios. And there have been times when I've said, oh my God, I have done that thing. Yes, but I didn't recognize it. Like no one was around to call me in on it.
Right.
And yet there it is in a book. And so, so there's that kind of external exploration. What does it look like? What does a microaggression look like? What are the scenarios where those things might happen? Another thing I saw this and I can't remember, I wish I could credit this person because I can't remember which webinar it was on. It was a design something that was about anti-racist work. And this person said that he talked about keeping a journal of racist things that he saw going on around him. Like
Ooh.
he just wanted to like, where is this happening? How do I recognize these things? And I can't remember what the transition was, but he said what he decided to do instead was to keep a journal of when he thought or did a racist thing.
Hmm.
And that those pages filled up much more quickly. And I
Wow.
think it was I know it's really like
Yeah.
powerful.
Yeah.
And I think the intention is one of constant self-observation and being open because, we just kind of like, oh, day, here's my day. And we just interact. And if I am interacting with the intention of observing my interactions,
Hmm.
and an openness, an agreement with myself that I'm going to be kind to myself in whatever I notice, I'm much more likely to see those things in myself. So I don't know about anybody else, but my points are points of interactive friction, like driving.
Hmm.
Like I find myself having racist thoughts when I'm driving. If I'm not happy with the interaction I'm having with other drivers, like I make assumptions and I hate that about myself. And it happens. And I can't just close my eyes and say, don't look at that, Andrea. I have to say, oh, be open to how many times you have an assumption. Because I
Hmm.
can't do anything about it. I can't interrupt it until I recognize that it's happening. So those are just some thoughts about recognizing the seeds
Mm-hmm.
and recognizing that I didn't plant them, but it's my job not to water them.
Mm-hmm. I think that's great. And it shows a really beautiful example of this anti-racism, and really all the isms is very deep inner work. It's self-reflective and it starts with you. You don't actually need to go out and protest right now. The best thing that you can do to serve anti-racism and making a better world that's more just and equitable for us all is to start with yourself. Start reading, start examining, start observing, because you are the person who all of this energy is going to come out from. And if you can even
Yeah.
start to curb a little bit of your own racist thinking and racist tendencies, that's going to make not only a huge difference for yourself and the people you're interacting with, but also the people who are watching around you, because we are all influencers, whether again in our family, at work,
Mm.
people are always watching us, right? And so when they see you starting to do these things, you starting to check your language, you treating people differently, that is going to just plant a little seed in them. And instead of it being a racist seed, it's going to be a seed. Oh, they
Mm-hmm.
didn't seed, or that's interesting. I wonder what, like, it's going to start the wheels turning. And I think we all have a very powerful opportunity to be those examples, but it starts with that deep work. And it Andrea, it sounds hard. It sounds long,
It's
but
it's iterative, and I also want to say that the not just is it the interrupting myself, I get to practice compassion with myself, and practicing that compassion with myself and that deeper understanding of my humanity makes it easier to have a difficult conversation with someone I care about, or even somebody I don't care about. I'm practicing compassion for our human condition when I practice that on myself.
yep.
So it helps me to enter a conversation from a place of compassion instead of a place of confrontation, where it is important to win and be
Mm-hmm.
right.
Yes. We talk about we can't love others if we can't love ourselves. We can't practice compassion for others if we can't practice it for ourselves. And this work it's needed. The compassion is needed, both for ourselves and for other people. And we're not going to get to where we want to go and where we want to be if we aren't able to embody that. So that was great. That was a really good question. The person who asked that, thank you. So I would love to dive into some of the questions that we have today. And Andrea, I have a video that I think might go well with the first kind of set of questions. So I know that I could probably pull that up for us and we can watch that. But it's a short video, and I'm sure, Andrea, I'm sure you've actually seen it. So it's the one on systemic racism, the
Okay.
little cartoon. Because we're talking about we're talking about anti-racism, but sometimes we need to have this larger umbrella of racism. And so, the first question that we got today is, how do you explain to someone who is really ignorant that a white person cannot be affected by racism? Is racism only directed on people of color and different races than Caucasians? So that's kind of like a two-part question. But I think that this is an interesting question because really it's talking about power, and does racism only flow one way? Can Black people be racist towards white people, or is it just because of the systems of power that we're in? That's not possible. What do you think, Andrea, when people ask you that? Because I know that you've had conversations like, are we racist like against white people? Is that even possible? Because I don't have power over them, and the system, doesn't support me in the way that it supports them.
What you've just described, that's prejudice, right? So
Mm-hmm.
short
Yes,
answer,
please.
reverse racism is not a thing. It is not a thing. And racism is the belief in the inherent differences and between races enforced by systems of power. The disadvantage and discrimination of non-white people in our instance, right? That is backed up by the powers that be. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I was like thinking about this question earlier today, and I was like, okay, I'm just like trying to play out this scenario. So let's just say that this is a reverse situation where like it's all black company and like the white person is discriminated against, right? Okay. So like racism is using power over someone in a negative way because of their race. But then I was like, okay, say that happens and that guy sues. Once he gets out of that all black space, he's back in the white system. So there's no longer racism that is going to like, it's all going to play to his or her advantage again. Right. And so I think that
racism really requires not just institutional power, but social power. Mm-hmm. Right? It's not just about our institutions, and it's not just about our economy. It is about the social order. It is deeply ingrained, and the power that holds in what our norms are. It is the power of norms as well as the power of laws and rules and regulations.
Yes, absolutely. So I want to show this little video on systemic racism, and then we can have a little chit chat about that, and then we'll take another question. And again, thank you for the questions in the Q&A. Feel free to keep throwing them in there. Let me share computer sound and go to, all right, let me make sure that this is at a good volume.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
Yeah. So, Andrea, will it let you unmute yourself? Okay, cool. I was paranoid. Yeah, I love that cartoon because it takes something that is a very big concept and it makes it very like clear. And they're just skimming the surface, of course, right? Because it's in more sectors than just those 4 that they talked about. But you've seen that before, yeah?
Actually, no, I hadn't seen that
Oh,
before. So yeah, that was really great. I mean, I hadn't seen it put together in that cartoon, but yeah.
yeah. So what are your, like, how do you feel like it does on helping people understand like systemic racism, like as a concept and kind of its, tendrils of impact?
Well, I think it literally connects the dots. Yeah, I mean, and it is very much an overview. I think it's, and I'm definitely like predisposed to think this, right? Because here I am. It makes me curious.
Mm-hmm.
I was looking at some of the systemic remedies, stopping predatory lending. Oh, we didn't talk about that in the cartoon. What does that have to do? Like, my next question is, what does that have to do with that? And I know what that has to do with it, but I was pleased to see that, like, how that fits in. So
Mm-hmm.
it makes it clearer, I think, that just the things that were mentioned in the cartoon are not the only story. So I recently watched a show. It's on PBS and it is available streaming, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
It's a 2-part series, moderated by or facilitated by Henry Louis Gates Jr.
Mm-hmm.
And it's called Reconstruction. And it blew my mind. I thought I knew a lot about Reconstruction, which is a heck of a lot more than what they taught me when I was in school. They're still not teaching this. So I thought I knew. So it hung out my DVR for a while. I did not know. And so much of what I learned in watching is directly connected to our experiences now in deep ways. And I encourage anybody who hasn't seen it to see it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, that's great. I mean, we just kind of go through our lives like thinking that we don't ask the question like, why? How did it get to be this way? Because it's just normal. But there's all of these reasons, and it blows your mind once you start to dig into it. And that's, one of the reasons why we're here is to start to have those conversations and get those little clues. Where are we most interested in digging in and learning more?
Yeah, I think that the simple answer when you just say, oh, why is it like this? And I think the simple answer that we give ourselves, or typically, perhaps, we say, oh, racism. That's why. Okay. And so what's important is to dig into that. What do you mean by that? What does that mean? Why racism? What kind of racism? How was racism operationalized to reach this result? That those are the questions, because it's easy to stop at, oh, racism.
Yeah. We can't do anything about that. So let's just move
Yeah.
on to the next topic. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Okay, so let's take another question. I think this is an interesting question and one that I've gotten in different formats throughout this series. So this person asks, when is it safe to bring racism up? As a white male, I feel like I can't know what it's like, and I feel like I don't have the right to say anything, but I want to be an ally and a supporter.
Is that for me?
I
Sure.
can go or you
Yeah.
can go. I was just
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is you, like white dude, you are exactly the right person to raise the subject. Like, if the intention is to interrupt a racist thing, or to call in one of your buddies or whatever, like a white man performing, and not performing is the wrong word. A white man in places of privilege, which is just about anywhere a white man goes, is a powerful embodiment of allyship to interrupt racism. Like, bring that subject up all the time. Model it. Like, model it for your fellow white men. Be an example of how to talk about it. It is only a shameful and difficult topic if we allow it to be. Right? It is, yeah, talk about it.
Yeah.
All the time. I don't even remember what the question was, but talk about it all the time.
Definitely talk about it. I mean, I think it's a lot of questions have come in around this idea of like, I'm white, I don't know what to say, I'm not sure if it's my place or not. What should I do? And I think we can break that down. Like, okay, so
Yeah.
I don't know what to say, right? So maybe I'm not going to say anything. And it really depends on like when is that moment, right? There are definitely times where inserting your voice, you don't need to. But then there are times when you're seeing racism happen around you, this is a time to interrupt as a human being. And it doesn't actually matter that you're white. It matters that you see something unjust going on and that you have an opportunity to interrupt it or not, right? And so I think maybe in some of the dialogues and some of the literature and some of the conversations happening out there, there's this idea like, oh, there's no place for like white voices in this, but that actually is completely wrong, right? Like, we need all of the voices at the table, everyone being vigilant, everyone on the lookout for where to interrupt racism, both inside themselves and outside of themselves. And so if you are white, if you are an ally, if you see something, like, say something. You are the person, to Andrea's point, because you have that privilege and that potential power and that opportunity. And we know a lot in like gender studies, right? Where in order for men to pay attention to the fact that women are being treated inequitably, another man has to tell them. In some cases, it's exactly the same thing where white people need to hear other white people saying, hey, that is not right. That's not cool. We're not going to do that. We're not going to say that. We're not going to talk like that, because they are unable to hear it from a brown person, right? And it goes back to that power dynamic and that peer and that identifying with, oh, well, that white lady doesn't think that this is okay. Well, maybe it isn't, right? So it's that whole idea of like, we have these biases, but we know that like likes like. I like you because you're like me. And when you say things, it resonates with me more than when someone who's different than me says it. So if a white person says it to another white person, it breaks right through that bias automatically, and it has more power, right? Mm-hmm. So having that opportunity and taking it.
The only time it's not okay, I want to caveat it, is if there's a person of color who's speaking about it. Like, yeah, you don't need a +1 is a great, is a great thing to do. That's a good action to take. What she said or what he said, and speaking over or speaking for a person of color in their presence is not a good look for anybody.
No. Yeah. When we're in places of privilege, we want to amplify the voices that are not of privilege, right? So you want to center them and center and lift. Yes, versus talk over or talk for. Absolutely. This person also talks about this idea of I don't know what to say. And so this is the point where, okay, so now you don't know what to say. You were in an uncomfortable situation. You didn't know what to say. Maybe you didn't say anything. Like, what do you do next? Well, you go and figure out like what to say, right? Like you go and educate yourself so that the next time that particular scenario comes up, you're able to speak on it. You're able to contribute a voice. Because, you know, I don't know, there's like this like kind of excuse that people give. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. But then you don't do anything about figuring out what you could do for the next time. Like in order to be in this anti-racist movement, you can't sit back and not do anything because you don't know. That's no longer an excuse. You have to figure out what to do. People around you, resources around you. Google is amazing. Like you could literally Google the exact scenario that happened to you and you will get answers. So that's no longer an excuse. I didn't want to say anything because I didn't know. Okay, well, what are you going to do to figure out what to do next time? What to say? How do you make it so that you do know?
So I also, I don't think it's,
please.
I don't think that it's always necessary to exactly know what to say before you say it. I think it's fine to say that feels icky to me. What is happening right now doesn't feel right to me. And it's about showing up. And this is where I think that compassionate self-work comes into play, to show up authentically and say, I feel bad about this. This just doesn't feel right to me. Because what I want to avoid in any conversation about race is, you know, the battle of statistics. You know, somebody saying, well, actually, I want to avoid all the well actuallys, both from other people and myself, because nobody wins that. That becomes an argument and not a conversation. So I think it's okay to just start with, it doesn't feel right to me what's happening here or what you just said there. And maybe we can break it down together. So that calling somebody in on it.
Yeah. Yeah. And Andrea, we've been saying call in and call out. Can you talk a little bit about like kind of what that means?
So to me, calling in is a direct invitation to dialogue that implies, and I can make that explicit, safe space to say, I'd like to talk to you about this. Help me understand this. This doesn't feel right to me. A compassionate calling out is, yeah, that was messed up. I can't believe you said that. You know, that was so racist. That is not a conversation, and it is sure to cause someone to result in somebody shutting down and defensiveness. I'm not going to get where I want to get to. That's calling out. And I find it performative. That's not allyship. That is the performance of allyship in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Unless it's followed by, I mean, you know, there are exceptions for everything, but for the most part.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I was talking to someone earlier today about this idea of calling out versus calling in, and very similar things came up, except for in the case where someone has great power and is blatantly misusing it, then like calling out is a different thing. Like that's, yes. I feel like it's appropriate, right?
Yes.
But when you're trying to connect with another human being that you know, that you have to work with, that you interact with in some way, the calling in does create that space and opportunity to connect, to understand, to discuss in a way. You're in the circle of trust, right? Versus like pushed out. And now we know that like nothing productive really is going to come from that, because at the end of the day, we want this connection. We want this understanding. We want this empathy. So we need to call each other into those opportunities versus pushing away.
When there are systems that are creating active harm in some way, ideally, you know, I think it makes sense to put yourself in front of the train.
Yes. Awesome. Okay. We can maybe take 2 more questions if we go quickly. So I want to jump to this one. So is using the word Black to describe someone offensive? Is the term African American preferred? And so we get this question a lot too. People want to know what is the right thing to say, but then there's also another like whole layer buried in there. So I'm going to take the first part. So people identify in different ways. I have friends who want to be called African American, and if you call them Black, they get offended because that particular friend takes very deep pride in her African heritage, and she does not want it to be taken out of her identity. Fair, valid. That is her truth. I have another friend who wants to be called Black because he is Black and he has a whole reason why he does not want to be called African American. Myself personally, I actually don't have a strong opinion one way or the other. You can call me either. And so this is one of those where it depends. And the best way to find out what someone wants to be called is to ask them. Now, I'm not telling you to go and ask all of your Black friends or African American friends what they want to be called. But in the opportunity that it comes up, you can just ask, hey, if it's all right, I want to ask you this question, and feel free not to answer it if you don't feel comfortable. One thing that I left out is not everyone who is African American, we have other Black African ethnicities that are in our country. It's not just African American, right? We've got like Afro-Jamaican, Afro-Cuban, Afro-Dominican, we've got a lot, right? And so even just thinking about the Black versus African American leaves out like so many other people. And so I feel like it's just good to ask. If you're curious, if you have a reason to want to know, just ask. And then if the person doesn't want to tell you, be okay with that. But they might appreciate, your curiosity versus, your assumption, right? So I don't know, Andrea, what do you think about that?
Yeah, what you said. And I'd like to break it down to maybe make this a little more comfortable. I think of it like asking somebody how they prefer their name to be pronounced. Like that's not a hard conversation. It's essentially the same thing. We're having the same conversation around pronouns. What are your preferred pronouns? And so we're having the same issue with Latino, Latina, Latinx, and Hispanic. Like that's a whole thing, right? So I feel you on, on the diversity within the diversity. Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to go to the first part of this question. Is calling someone Black offensive? And that, I'm sorry, I'm having like a lot of laughs today. I'm not laughing at any of these questions because this is a judgment-free zone, but I just think it's just so interesting. Black, I am Black. And so it's okay to refer to me as a Black person, but because we're so afraid of talking about race in this country, so we're not allowed to talk about politics or religion. We're so not allowed to talk about race. It's not even mentioned in that list, but I would say it's probably the number one thing, right? And so even mentioning someone's race, the Black lady, it's okay. She's Black. I'm Black. It's as a descriptor, as an adjective, it is not offensive because it's a fact. That's how I see it, Andrea. I don't know how you see it.
Yeah, I just have such compassion for that question because it is a thin veneer over what I read in it is an understanding that as a culture in America, in white culture, Black is bad. Inherent in that question is an understanding and a shame about that.
Wow.
And a deep desire to not want to not be a part of that.
Wow.
And so the next step in that journey is understanding that Black as an identification beyond descriptor is a thing of pride, is a thing of power. They haven't gotten there yet. And I hope that whoever asked that question listens to this and sees that they're on a journey too, and it's okay. I just have such compassion for it because it's a hard place to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've never thought about it like that, for sure. And that was a really beautiful answer, because there is the fear, right? You can feel the fear in I don't want to not only be offensive, but I don't even want to say the word. And I think it comes from what you were saying.
Yeah. Why is it even offensive? Why do you think it's offensive? And it's offensive because we've been taught that it's bad.
Mm-hmm.
That it's a terrible thing to be.
Yeah. And that's just not true. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
So we have time. We're going to squeeze in one more question here. But I hope that everyone is seeing like all of these questions, even ones that seem really simple or short, have so many layers, right? There's so much depth because there's so much unpacking to do when we think about race and anti-racism in this country, where it comes from, what it means, how it's affecting us, and then how we're peeling back the layers now by asking these questions. Everyone that's asked a question, these are brave questions to ask, right? And then to take those answers in and to use that as part of your journey to continue to learn, to continue to grow, continue to figure out where your space is in moving this movement forward. So just thank you everyone for the great questions. Andrea, is there one that you want to cover before we wrap up? And I know we're going to go a couple minutes over because there's none of these questions can be answered in 3 minutes, but we will not go too much longer, I promise.
Yeah, so I'm really feeling the question about privilege. Isn't the term white privilege racist or reverse racist too? Why is this term so heavily used when anyone could be classified as privileged? So in the interest of time, I'm just going to kind of break this down. Term white privilege is not racist.
It's
White
kind of that
privilege is a
same
thing.
It's the same from the question before, like calling someone their race is racist. It's not. So, you know.
Well, oh God, that's a whole other question. I recommend that people read, it was in the New York Times, an editorial about why it's time to capitalize in our media, why it's time to capitalize the word white when describing white people. So there's your reading assignment, super insightful. But white privilege is not a racist thing. White privilege is a thing, and anyone who is white or presents as white benefits from it. I once saw a quote somewhere, it was probably like on Instagram, you know, one of those things, and it said, privilege is anything that isn't a problem for you. Went, oh yeah, yeah. And why is this term so heavily used when anybody could be classified as privileged? Well, because we all are in many ways. I think, you know, so I identify, like I said, I identify as a queer Latina with light skin privilege. I present as both white and I pass as straight. Right? I just do. People make that assumption for me. And so it's very important for me to claim my identity in spaces. My light skin has enabled me to escape much of the scrutiny and the discrimination that my darker skinned siblings have experienced. And I also have privilege in my ability. So I'm just going to throw this word in there too, intersectionality. Like I'm a combination of things. I'm also a woman and I'm a woman of color. And as that, I experience disadvantages that other people who are not women of color do not experience. So, yeah, I don't know if that really broke it down much. It's just a short answer.
That's okay. It is, I mean, it's layers again. And, you know, you touched on the fact that we all have privileges. Even living in America, regardless of where you live, you have privileges. Being educated is a privilege. Living in a certain area is a privilege. Having full use of all of your faculties is a privilege, right?
Yes.
And so what white privilege is everyone has privileges, and on the converse, everyone has problems. But as a white person, the color of your skin is not creating problems or negative impact for you. And so one of the pushbacks for people who don't understand what white privilege is, they're like, oh, you know, I'm not like, you know, Donald Trump, who was born with a silver spoon in my mouth and handed everything. Like, people think of privilege as like this ultimate, like, you know, perfect life, but that is not what privilege is. I mean, that's a certain kind of privilege, but that is not the definition of white privilege. Everyone has challenges, but the color of your skin is not a challenge for you. One of the ways that I saw it talked about was like, okay, so if we're all in a race, white people are getting a head start. You may not win the race, but you absolutely got a head start. And other people aren't getting that same head start. So it doesn't guarantee you're going to win because of all the other obstacles that as humans in the human condition we face. But you are given this advantage that has only to do with the color of your skin. And we're not experiencing that.
And privilege functions in a system of scarcity. in the context of an arbitrary understanding of scarcity, that there's not enough. And therefore, those with privilege are advantaged and those without a name privilege are disadvantaged. So white privilege advantages white and white presenting people with benefits that those without white privilege don't, at the disadvantage of other people. It's a zero-sum game in some instances, and we saw in the racism cartoon examples and the profound ramifications of that white privilege. The way that systems, I mean, that is the ultimate white privilege, the fact that systems and social norms are set up to benefit white people at the expense of people of color. I mean, that's how it works.
And it's normal for people to not realize their privilege, because privilege is something that is invisible to you and is normal. And so as we are understanding what it means to be anti-racist, uncovering and understanding those privileges is a huge part of that. Where are you experiencing privileges? And then how can you use your privilege and your power for good? You know, you have the privilege as a white person of not being followed in stores, and not being followed by the police, in not being passed over because your name sounds ethnic, like all of these privilege, but you're like, no, that's just normal. Well, for you, it's normal, but for other people, it's not normal. And so it's totally okay that it's invisible, but your job is to make it visible, and then to start to understand where you can disrupt these systems that are negatively impacting other people, so that they can have the same opportunities as you and the privilege that you've, just had. Which, we're not blaming, we're not shaming, but we're just raising awareness, because it's time for a leveling of
right. It's not something to feel bad about, right? It is not, this isn't just another check mark in the shame column. This is an opportunity for self-examination and understanding. And it is also a white ally's secret weapon, right? It is the reason why the person who asked the question about, I'm a white male, can I talk about racism? It is why that voice is so important, because that voice gets to be in places where my voice can't be, and where your voice, Carrie, can't be. Those are spaces where I'm not invited and I can't get into without a fight. So I use my privilege, like, consciously when I'm in spaces where I can make a difference to dismantle the system.
Right. How can I bring in the voices that are not there, because I am there because of my privilege?
Yes,
so
exactly.
That all the voices are here because they're with me. I'm bringing them with me, and they're not silent, right? And so that is really the biggest opportunity of white privilege, but of any privilege, helping to bring in the people who cannot be there because the system does not allow them.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, we are at 5:04. Andrea, any last, I know it goes so fast, any last thoughts, any last insights you want to leave everyone with before we wrap up today?
No.
All right.
Yeah, so I loved that reconstruction thing so much. So I want to say that again. I think it's essential viewing, essential.
Okay, I'm actually writing that one down too as well. So Andrea, I want to just say thank you so much. I know that I would love to have you again. I would love to talk more with you about all of these topics. I appreciate you spending your time with us today and giving us your insight as well. And thank you everyone for coming today. I hope that we answered some of your questions and also sparked some new questions inside of you, and just continue the journey, continue digging in. We are at the Inclusion First Project. We're actually going to take 1 week off. We've been going since the end of July. We're going to take off the first week of September, but then we will be back with a new day and a new time to continue to answer your questions throughout September. If you'd like to learn more, you can visit us at theinclusionfirstproject.org, and please keep submitting your questions, because yes, Andrea.
Yeah, go ahead.
Please keep submitting your questions, because we are trying to collect 500 questions from anti-racism allies so that we can actually take a look at them, understand the themes, and then start to create even better answers, more resources, more support for you on your anti-racism journey. So please submit your questions. Andrea, you had a Another.
Yeah, I think that it's an excellent way to practice having conversations about race with the people in your circle, even with just, acquaintances. Talk about this project and give them the link to submit their own questions.
I love that. Thank you so much. All right. Thank you everyone for being here today. We will see you next time. Bye.